Now, next year's local government elections will now have a total of 4,468 voting wards, which is an addition of 76 wards following the ward delimitation process. The Municipal Demarcation Board has officially handed over the ward boundaries to the Independent Electoral Commission, or the IEC, which allows them to then begin the final preparations for the local government elections. And this includes finalising voting districts, station locations, and of course embarking on registration initiatives. Masego Sheburi is the Deputy Commissioner of the IEC and joins us now to discuss some of these developments. Mr. Sheburi, thanks so much for your time. Welcome to Morning Live once again.
Good morning.
So we're talking about an additional 76 wards that have now been added following this process. Please tell us a little bit more about the ward delimitation process, how exactly it works and what necessitates this particular process before elections.
Ahead of each general election of municipal councils, the Municipal Demarcation Board, which is a separate institution, a constitutional institution, delimits municipalities into wards. And that is done primarily to account for the shift in settlement patterns, to accommodate the densities that may have arisen since the last demarcation, so that you have an almost equal spread of residents against a person who is elected to represent them. So the primary purpose is to ensure that wards in municipalities have on average almost an equal number of persons, so that a councillor in any specific ward services a reasonable size of the voting population.
So during this process, just how much consultation is there, if any, with the people in the affected wards?
The MDB, in terms of its program, which it makes available, had a series of engagement meetings with communities, with municipalities, with stakeholders in those municipalities. There is also a legal process, so meaning there's first a public awareness and public campaign, as well as public consultation meeting. But on top of that, there is a legally prescribed process in terms of which members of the public may make representation to the board to propose new wards or to object to wards that may have been determined. Beyond the close of that process, the MDB is required then to adjudicate on all the submissions that it has received and determine the number of wards. On our part, our role begins once we have received the wards, as we have done yesterday. And we now know that of the 4,400 odd wards that have been determined, because there are 76 new wards, there are implications on our voting district. The IEC is responsible for voting district, while the MDB is responsible for the ward boundaries. We will now look at all the 1,123 voting districts that have been affected by the ward boundaries, meaning we had a voting district. It has now been split by the new ward boundaries that have been determined by the MDB. In other words, where we used to have one community, now that community is split by a ward boundary. We must make sure that we redraw the boundaries of our voting district so that each voting district locates in a single ward. Early in the new year, we will commence the process of interaction with affected voters in those voting districts and wards to inform them that their ward boundaries have changed, and consequently their voting district have changed and their voting stations have therefore changed. We will then re-register those persons into their correct voting districts that accord with the new ward boundaries that will take effect on the day of elections next year.
So after the Demarcation Board did their work, they then handed over to you as the IEC, and you talk about going back into these communities next year ahead of the local government elections in January, you said. But what does that mean in terms of the finalization of the process? Because we have seen previously, Mr. Sheburi, where communities have actually resisted, where they have fought some of these demarcations and delimitations and they've actually refused to vote because they had in instances been moved from one province even into a next.
Okay. For this current round of delimitation, there has not been changes to the municipal boundaries. So people will still be in the same municipalities that they were in during the 2016 local government election. The only changes that have been effected are within the confines of those municipal spaces in the geography of the ward. Even where the ward boundary has changed, people are not relocated physically. But we accept that in the past, there have been consternation arising from persons being moved from those voting boundaries. We are informed by the MDB that sometime next year they will undertake a project to publicize the new ward, and they've termed it Know Your Ward. So out of that process, we will have an opportunity then to gauge the level of dissatisfaction, if there's any, with the new ward boundaries that have been determined. But on our part, we are bound by law to make sure that our network of 23,000 voting stations are called to the new ward boundaries that have been delimited. We do not have an option but to recorrect the registration of persons whose registration status on the voters' roll may have been impacted by the determination of new ward. And as I said, we already know that we have 1,123 voting districts that have been so affected, and we have no option but to communicate with those persons with a view to re-register them onto the correct voting segment for preparations for 2021 elections of municipal councils.
Mr. Sheburi, where exactly are these 76 additional wards? Where have they been created?
The 76 additional wards are split across all the nine provinces. But typically, you'll expect where there's been a sizable shift in population densities or in settlement patterns, that's where the preponderance of the wards will obtain. But the wards are split in the majority of provinces, except for a few provinces that have not gained any new wards, i.e. The Northern Cape, the province of Mpumalanga. Those provinces have not gained new wards. But provinces with high population densities like Gauteng, the Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, and the Western Cape would have gained new wards.
And then you spoke about the 1,123 voting districts that were now split during this demarcation process. In terms of the objections that you also mentioned that people may have because they would have to register again, is there any indication as to when exactly that sort of engagement will take place?
The processes at the instance of the Municipal Demarcation Board have run their course. They have been concluded. There is no longer an opportunity for persons to object to the new wards that have been determined. On our part, our job is just to re-register persons whose voting district may have been impacted by the ward boundary. We will communicate with those persons. We will inform them of the reason why we need to re-register them. And in terms of the electoral law, those persons may make representation to the CEO or to the commission to say why they should not be moved from those voting districts. But in an event that their registration is occasioned by a split or a redrawing of their new voting boundaries, those persons will not have any grounds to refuse to be re-registered correctly, because if they do not re-register, they risk chances that they may not be able to vote because a person at a voting station may object to their inclusion on a segment of the voters' roll where there is no nexus between their place of ordinary residence and the ward in which they wish to register. So we'll appeal to communities that even if they are dissatisfied for one reason or another with the demarcated ward boundaries, they should still avail themselves of the opportunity to re-register in their correct voting stations so that they safeguard their right to participate in the upcoming local government elections.
Now, Mr. Sheburi, those upcoming local government elections, the rules and regulations is what many voters are probably wondering about for next year's elections, given the pandemic COVID-19 that is still with us. how are your preparations progressing at this point? We know you had a bit of a dry run with the by-elections that were held recently, but for next year, is there anything specific that you can tell us that you have actually at this point concluded in terms of how the elections will actually play out?
The statutory remit to determine the date of the election rests with the minister responsible for cooperative governance and traditional affairs. The Commission has begun consultations with the minister, but the date remains still indeterminate. But we know that those elections must be held sometime between the 4th of August and no later than the 1st of November. On our part, we are planning as though the pandemic will still be a factor come the election. So we're making the necessary adjustments in our training guides. We have made the necessary adjustment in the voting process as we had piloted in the November by-elections. We have an opportunity again next week to refine those measures in a number of by-elections that we are again hosting. So for next year's election, we are planning as though the pandemic will be an issue. We're providing the requisite level of PPE at the voting station for our staff. We are enforcing, in terms of our training, the requirements for social distancing, including limiting the number of persons that we have in the voting district. Similarly, we have revised our approach as it relates to home visits, so that when we go to do home visit, we plan as though we may encounter a person who is infected, or that some of our staff member may be infected, and therefore we must limit the possibility of transmission between staff and the voting public. If when we hold election next year, the pandemic would be a thing of the past, then we will have to readjust and just drop the requirements for PPE. But I think the new normal will still require us to maintain safe distancing and some form of public health measures to ensure that voting stations do not become super spreader platforms.
So those measures, the safety precautions that you have to implement are likely also to be time consuming in certain instances. So is that likely to affect some of the voting times that we usually see? I think we usually open at at 7 o'clock, is it? The voting stations?
That's correct. The voting stations time are determined between 7 o'clock in the morning and 2100 hours in the evening. However, the Commission has a prerogative to determine new voting hours. We will be drawing lessons from the by-elections that we held in November and the by-elections that we're holding next week to make a determination whether the implementation of safety measures at the voting station prolonged the voting process or added to the voting times, and we'll make then a judgment call to see whether there's a need to retain the voting hours or even to revise them downwards. From the research that we've done in a number of general elections, we already know that the majority of the voting public vote between the time when stations open at 7 and by about half past 11 in the morning, an election is already won or has been lost because the majority of voters have voted then. Beyond 1900 hours, there is insignificant numbers of persons that come to voting station in both municipal council elections and in the national and provincial elections. So we will make a call based on the lessons that we've drawn from by-elections, but also including the research that we've done over time, over the general registration weekend. We hope, as has been the tradition, that voting day will also be a public holiday. That way, persons can make their time, they can take turns and vote in the morning, and there won't be a need to vote beyond 1900 hours.
And then, of course, the impact that this would have on your budget, finally, Mr. Sheburi, and also Parliament's Home Affairs Committee rejecting the proposal to allow other voting methods like electronic voting. Just your comments on those very briefly.
Like the totality of the state and all other state-funded institutions, we're facing a difficulty of dwindling fiscal resources. Like all state entities, we have had to surrender some of the baseline allocations that we've had. We estimate that for a general registration weekend, we'll need in around 60 million to make sure that we have sufficient PPE to safeguard voters and our electoral staff. We are yet to quantify the budget needs for as it relates to safety measures for the election. The Portfolio Committee on Home Affairs yesterday voted to adopt the amendments that were proposed on the Electoral Laws Amendment Bill. The only two clauses that the committee rejected related to our proposal to include into the law avenues that will facilitate us being able to pilot other forms of voting in 2021. The committee said they needed to first understand those. We need also to take the South African public with us so that we do not enact laws that do not resonate with the expectation of the South African public. We were happy to stand down on those two provisions, and we are happy that the committee has now adopted the bill, and we hope that that bill will be debated in the National Assembly still before it rises this legislative season, and then early next year we'll commence the process of the bill in the NCOP so that we can then finalize the regulations for those new provisions of the law and to implement the law in next year's election. The big thing that is contained in the law that we are happy the committee has approved is that for the first time we can strongly regulate the distribution of the voters' roll in order to protect the personal information of voters, given the instances of identity fraud. Secondly, we are happy that the committee has approved a clause that we have included that makes it clear that South Africans who are registered on the voters' roll, but for whom the Electoral Commission still does not have an address, are still entitled to vote, and those will supply a description of their address or a description of their place of ordinary residence before they vote. So we are happy on the balance that the key things that we needed to prepare for next year's elections have been passed by the committee.
Well, thank you so much for your time this morning, Mr. Masego Sheburi, IEC's Deputy Commissioner, talking to us about the Municipal Demarcation Board handing over the ward boundaries to the IEC for next year's local government elections.